This is a key to quadratic equations, extra number one, and that was the dealing with topic 26. And notice you have all these quadratic equations. Those are simple kinds of quadratic equations. And it says solve each quadratic equation using the square root property. So make sure you follow directions. It did say use the square root property and simplify radicals. It did say no work is necessary. Now, obviously, you have to do something to get the answers. But keep in mind that it says use the imaginary unit when appropriate. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at number one. So number one, we have x squared equal 25. And so the direction is set to use the square root property. Now remember, you're going to use the square root property whenever you have some expression squared equal a number. And we have that here. We have some expression, which is just x, being squared equal a number. And then the square root property says this: when you have let's say b squared equal c, then to solve for b, you're going to take the square root of both sides. And don't forget though, when you take the square root of both sides, you're going to get plus or minus. So you get b equal plus or minus the square root of c. All right, and so that's a process you're going to use. So that was the idea of that square root property. All right. So notice that in all these cases, well, for quite a few of them, you do have this form where you have some expression squared equal a number. So right away, I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to rewrite this over. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and then don't forget, when you take the square root of both sides, you get plus or minus. The square and the square root into each other, so you get x equal plus or minus, and the square root of 25 is 5. And that's your solution. And you can easily check this because 5, when you substitute 5 into x, 5 times itself is 25. When you substitute negative 5 times negative 5 is 25. Okay? So the answer number 1 is x equal plus or minus 5. All right, number 2. You have this in number 2, you have x squared equal negative 18. All right, so again, you have x squared by itself. So you have this form here. So I can easily use the square root property. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over. And when I take the square root of both sides, the square and the square root into each other, so notice I get x by itself. But on this side, you got to remember, you got to do the plus or minus. Keep also in mind that this is the square root of a negative 18, so you got to remember in previous lessons how to deal with that. Remember, that's the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 18. And remember, the square root of negative 1 is I. And then the square root of 18, that's the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. The square root of 9 is 3, so we get 3i square root of 2. So this becomes plus or minus 3i square root of 2. All right, so that's number 2. So number 2, you have x equal plus or minus 3i square root of 2. Number 3. Now, the problem number 3 is you notice that the x squared is not by itself. So I'm going to go ahead and add 27 to both sides. And when I do that, I get x squared equal 27. And now we have this form right here where we have some expression squared equal a number. So we have that form there, this right here. And so once we get it to look like that, then I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to write this over. And so I'm going to take the square root of both sides, plus or minus, the square and the square root into each other, so you get x equal plus or minus. Now remember, you got to simplify your radicals. So the largest perfect square that goes into 27 is 9. So that's the square root of 9 times the square root of 3, so you get 3 square root of 3. So this becomes plus or minus 3 square root of 3. So that's answer number 3. So the answer number 3 is plus or minus x equal plus or minus 3 square root of 3. Number 4. Okay, now when doing number 4, you got to remember something. So we have 2x squared minus 28 equals 0. So remember, whenever you are using this property right here, the square root property, you have to have some expression squared equal a number. That number in front of the parentheses here, or in front of the part that's being squared, has to be 1. This has to be a 1 right here. Okay? So notice that this x squared, that's a 2. So at some point, I'm going to have to divide by 2 to get this just to be x squared. So first of all, I'm going to add 28 to both sides. and so I get 2x squared equal 28. And now I'm going to divide by 2. Okay, don't take the square root of both sides. You're going to mess up if you do that. Most students at this point do have an issue if they go ahead and take the square root of both sides. They're going to make a mistake. So what I would do first is to divide both sides by 2. And so 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 times x squared equal 14. And then you take the square root of both sides, plus or minus, and so you get x equal, the square and the square root into each other, so you get x equal plus or minus the square root of 14, and you cannot simplify the square root of 14. The only perfect square that goes into 14 is 1. So this becomes plus or minus the square root of 14. All right, now I just want to say this. So remember when I just said a while ago that the next thing you need to do is to divide both sides by 2. Some students are going to do this and not know what to do. They get confused. So some students are going to forget about that. They're going to say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Okay, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You just got to be careful because now you have this. You have this becomes right here, when you use the product property, this becomes the square root of 2 times x, because the square root of x squared is x. And this becomes right here, this becomes plus or minus, and then this is the square root of 28 becomes the square root of 4 times the square root of 7, so that's 2 square root of 7. Okay? But then you got to divide by the square root of 2, because you got to solve for x, right? So when I divide by the square root of 2, just like this, I get x equal plus or minus 2 square root of 2 divided, square root of 7 divided by the square root of 2. But then you got to remember from a previous lesson, you don't want to square root in the denominator. So you're going to rationalize this denominator. So now you're going to multiply the numerator and denominator by the square root of 2. And so this becomes 7 times 2 is 14. So this becomes plus or minus 2 square root of 14 divided by, and remember the square root of 2 times square root of 2 is 2. And then these 2's divide out, so you get plus or minus square root of 14. All right. So notice that when students forget to divide by 2, which is the easiest thing to do, and they leave it like this, even though they may take the square root of both sides, many students don't know how to go from here to there. But that's all you're doing. You're just using things that you've learned in the past to get you to that point where this is the same as this. But I want you to notice it is so much easier that when you get to this point, if you don't have x squared by itself, if you have a number other than 1, it is so much easier to divide by that coefficient. All right, so number 4. Number 5, same idea. Number 5, you have 2x squared minus 90 equals 0. Number 5. So again, we're going to add 90 to both sides. And so I get 2x squared equal 90. Remember with our discussion, the best thing to do is get x squared by itself. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 2. And when I do that, I get x squared equal 45. I'm going to go ahead and divide, take the square root of both sides. So I've got your plus or minus. The square and the square root into each other. So I get x equal plus or minus. And then the square root of 45, when I simplify that, is the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. So that's 3 square root of 5. So plus or minus 3 square root of 5. So that's number 5. So the answer for number 5 is plus or minus 3 square root of 5. Okay. Number 6. In number 6, we have x squared plus 121 equals 0. And so we'll go ahead and subtract 121 from both sides. So I get x squared equal a negative 121. So now notice I have x squared by itself, so I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides at this point. Don't forget the plus or minus. The square and the square root into each other, so you get x equal plus or minus the square root of a negative 121. But you got to remember, the square root of a negative 121 means the same thing as the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 121. The square root of a negative 1 is I. The square root of 121 is a perfect square. That's 11. So this becomes 11i. So our solution will be plus or minus 11i. So that's x. So plus or minus 11i. Okay, number 7. So number 7, we have x squared plus 8 equal 36. So again, I got to get x squared by itself, so I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. And so when I do that, I'm going to get x squared equal, this is 0, so I get x squared equal, and then 36 minus 8 is 28. And now I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. I'm going to write this over. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Remember, you take the square root of both sides, you get plus or minus. And so I get x equal plus or minus, and then the square root of 28. If I simplify that, that's the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. And so that's 2 square root of 7. So plus or minus 2 square root of 7. So that's number 7. So plus or minus 2 square root of 7. Okay, number 8. All right, so let's number 8. So number 8, we have this for number 8. We have 4x squared equals 16. So getting x squared by itself, I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 4. And so 4 divided by 4 is 1. So I get x squared equal 4. Taking the square root of both sides, plus or minus, I get x to be plus or minus 2. Because 4 is a perfect square, the square root of 4 is 2. So x equal plus or minus 2. Number 9. In number 9, we have x squared plus 12 equal 8. So getting x squared by itself, I'm going to go ahead and subtract 12 from both sides. And so when I do that, I'm going to get x squared equal negative 4. At this point, to get x by itself, right now I'm squaring, the opposite of squaring is to take the square root of both sides, plus or minus. These undo each other, so you get x to be plus or minus the square root of a negative 4. You have to remember, the square root of a negative 4 means the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 4. The square root of a negative 1 is I, the square root of 4 is 2, so this becomes 2i. So this here, my solutions then become x equal plus or minus 2i. So plus or minus 2i is the answer for number 9. And then number 10, we have this in number 10. We have negative 2x squared equal 40. All right, so to get x squared by itself, I'm going to divide both sides by negative 2. And so when I do that, negative 2 divided by negative 2 is 1. 1 times x squared equal negative 20. And so I'm going to just go and rewrite this over. So now the next step is to get x by itself. Right now I'm squaring. The opposite of squaring is the square root, both sides. Don't forget plus or minus, though. The square and the square root undo each other. So you get x equal plus or minus. All right, now over here, we got to figure out the square root of a negative 20. Well, remember, that means the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 20. And I can simplify the square root of 20. The largest perfect square that goes into 20 is 4. So this becomes I times the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. And the square root of 4 is 2, so this becomes I times 2 square root of 5. Rewriting this, though, I'm going to write it as plus or minus 2I square root of 5. All right, so the answer number 10 is x equal plus or minus 2I square root of 5. Okay? So that is the key to quadratic equations extra number 1.